This is the video for 70s America on Nixon and Vietnam. President Richard M. Nixon, considered ending the Vietnam conflict to be his chief task once he was elected in 1968. During his 1968 campaign, he played down the Vietnam issue, although he insisted he would end the war on honorable terms if he was elected, which he was. Nixon first proposed a phased withdrawal of all non-South Vietnamese troops, i.e. American, then to be followed by internationally supervised elections in South Vietnam. North Vietnamese rejected this scheme and insisted that the United States withdraw its forces immediately and allow Vietnam to be reunited under communist rule under Ho Chi Minh. This ultimatum by North Vietnam placed Nixon in a tight spot. Probably most Americans favored ending the Vietnam conflict this way, through just getting out of it immediately. But there were just as many people in the United States who did not want to see the war end on the communist terms. For each day that Nixon could not convince the North Vietnamese to end the war through negotiation, anti-war sentiment in the United States grew. Nixon responded to the North Vietnamese rejection by trying to build up South Vietnamese armed forces so that American troops could pull out of South Vietnam without the communists overrunning the country. Nixon shipped so many planes to the Vietnamese that South Vietnam came to have the fourth largest air force in the world. This is Vietnamization, the so-called buildup of South Vietnamese forces. The problem with the Vietnamization strategy is that it was a continuation of what the United States had tried to do for 15 years. Get the South Vietnamese capable of defending themselves without American military support, something the United States never could do. In June 1969, Nixon announced a gradual withdrawal of troops of 25,000, and that another 35,000 troops would leave South Vietnam in December. This did little to quell the anti-war protesters. On October 15th, college students organized a nationwide anti-war demonstration called Vietnam Moratorium Day. A second demonstration by 250,000 people to march by the White House, protesting in front of the lawn. President Nixon was unmoved. He claimed he had spent the same amount of time watching a football game. On November 3rd, 1969, Nixon restated his commitment to remove troops gradually. And after a flood of letters and telegrams came into the White House supporting Nixon's position, Nixon declared that a silent majority agreed with his policy. The gradual withdrawal seemed to prove Nixon right. It reduced the number of casualties to what those who did not find the war morally unbearable to be tolerable troop levels in Vietnam. But Vietnam had caused problems within the military itself. Between 1969 and 1971, there were 730 reported fragging incidents, efforts by troops to kill or injure their own officers. Drug abuse became a major problem in the military, as it became the leading cause for soldiers' hospitalization. Then, to make things worse, reports surfaced in 1970 that an American unit had massacred children in the Vietnamese hamlet known as My Lai back in 1968. This just fueled the controversy among the American people on the justification of the Vietnam conflict. In many people's minds, we didn't belong there. Nixon now seems stuck between a rock and a hard place. For when Nixon reduced troops, as the anti-war supporters wanted, the communists simply just moved in once the troop levels decreased. But then when Nixon raised troop levels, many of his own people in the Republican Party denounced him for his actions. And if he withdrew altogether, another segment of Americans will be outraged because that would be declaring Vietnam to be a loss. Historian John Garrity wrote that perhaps Nixon's problem lay within himself. and his own unwillingness to admit his own uncertainty, which is something that Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt had no problem doing. Instead, Nixon tried to convince the world that he had the crisis under control, when in fact he did not. In April 1970, Nixon then announced that Vietnamization was proceeding better than he expected, and that another 150,000 American soldiers would leave South Vietnam. A week later, he announced that military intelligence had found the enemy gathering in Cambodia, which is just to the west of South Vietnam, and that he dispatched American troops to stop that. This meant escalating Vietnam, raising troop levels in South Vietnam. To justify his actions, Nixon just told the Joint Chiefs of Staff, "You've got to electrify people with bold actions. So let's just go blow the hell out of them." Now, students took Nixon's news hard. They started holding campus demonstrations, protesting the invasion of Cambodia. Anti-war feelings ran particularly high at Kent State University in the state of Ohio. For several days, students there clashed with local police. They broke windows and caused other property damage. And when the governor of Ohio called in the National Guard, angry students showered the soldiers with stones. And on May 4th, 1970, the National Guardsmen opened fire during a noontime protest. 4 college students were killed. 2 of them were women who were just passing by on their way to class. And before the nation could recover from Kent State, from the horror at Kent State, news came from Mississippi that Mississippi policemen had killed 2 student protesters at Jackson State University. More student strikes against Vietnam followed across the country, which forced the temporary closing of hundreds of colleges. The almost universal condemnation of the invasion and of the way it had been planned and announced by the country shook Nixon hard. He decided to pull troops out of Cambodia. It still seems like he's between this rock and the hard place. But Nixon didn't change his Vietnam policy, although instead he just stiffened his determination. As he withdrew ground forces in South Vietnam, he stepped up air attacks. When the North Vietnamese mounted a series of assaults throughout South Vietnam, Nixon responded with heavier bombing. These are the Christmas bombings of 1972. In response, the North Vietnamese appeared more flexible at the negotiating table in response to the Christmas bombings. At the same time, Nixon dropped his insistence that all North Vietnamese troops leave South Vietnam. In fact, what Nixon is going through is the beginning of his détente policy. At the Paris peace talks in January 1973, the United States, North and South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed an agreement ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. This agreement called for a ceasefire between the North and the South, the return of American prisoners of war, and for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. The last U.S. troops left South Vietnam in March 1973. The North Vietnamese left 150,000 troops in South Vietnam. Within months, without American support, the ceasefire fell, and communist forces gained an upper hand in South Vietnam. Soon, there were communist governments in Cambodia and Laos, as well as North Vietnam. In 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a full-scale armored invasion against South Vietnam, and South Vietnam fell. The capital, Saigon, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Significance of the Vietnam conflict. Vietnam, the longest conflict in U.S. history, has a bitter legacy or significance. Over 2 million combatants and civilians were killed on both sides. Many of those American soldiers who returned home suffered from drug or alcohol addiction or severe psychological disorders. Most veterans readjusted well to civilian life, but even they carried with them the stigma of a lost war. This is the first time the United States lost. The loss of the Vietnam conflict and news of American atrocities such as at My Lai eroded the young's respect for the military, because to the young, a military career now seemed corrupt. For many Americans, what started out as a noble war for democratic ideals now just proved that some nations do not have the historical background to adjust to democratic ideals. The war sapped the national will and fragmented the national consensus that had governed foreign affairs since 1947. It undermined LBJ's domestic policy, the Great Society, and splintered the Democratic Party in 1968 into four factions. The phrase, the lesson of Vietnam, has different meanings for different people. For those who believe in isolationism, the phrase means a refusal to commit any troops at all in any situation. But for those who believe in intervention, the phrase means massive retaliation that does not restrict the president from gaining an outright victory. Thank you.